My name is Lila Monroe, and if you're reading this, chances are you've heard some version of a story that's been making waves in corporate circles. The one where I let the CEO's son fire me. Yes, let him. And then froze a $900 million deal right under his nose. It sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Almost too good to be true. But trust me when I say this isn't just about revenge or proving a point. It's about so much more than that. This is my story. A tale of power, betrayal, resilience, and maybe even redemption. I was never supposed to end up here, sitting across from James Whitaker III, the golden boy with an ego bigger than the skyscraper we worked in, at a boardroom table as he handed me what he thought would be my walking papers. 4 years, I had clawed my way through the ranks at Velas Corp, a company known for its cutting-edge tech solutions but infamous for its toxic culture. And no, before you ask, I didn't get there because someone handed me a leg up. Every promotion, every late night spent poring over spreadsheets, every ounce of sweat and tears, it all came from me. But let's rewind to how it all started, shall we? Because the moment James walked into that room on a crisp Monday morning, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, everything changed. He slid a folder toward me, his lips curling into a smug grin. "Lila," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you've been disruptive. We appreciate your efforts, but unfortunately, your services are no longer required." Disruptive. That word stung more than anything else he could have said. Not because it wasn't true, but because it confirmed exactly what I'd suspected all along. They were scared of me. Scared of what I represented. Scared of change. What James didn't know, and what nobody in that room realized, was that I had already seen this coming. Weeks earlier, whispers had reached my ears about restructuring and streamlining operations. Translation: they wanted me gone. Why? Because I refused to play their game. While everyone else kissed ass and nodded along, I spoke up. When projects failed due to mismanagement, I called them out. When interns were treated like disposable cogs in their machine, I fought for them. Some might call it naivety, but I prefer to think of it as integrity. Unfortunately, integrity doesn't always pay the bills or keep you employed. As James leaned back in his chair, clearly relishing the moment, I took a deep breath. This was it. The culmination of months of tension, of being undermined, sidelined, and dismissed. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw the folder back in his face and tell him exactly what I thought of him and his entitled little empire. But instead I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that made his confidence waver ever so slightly. "Thank you, James," I said calmly, standing up and straightening my blazer. "You've done me a favor." And with that, I walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind not just my job but also the final piece of leverage I needed to execute the plan I'd been quietly building for weeks. You see, freezing the $900 million deal wasn't something I did impulsively. No, it was calculated, strategic, ruthless even. Because while James and his father, Richard Whitaker, the larger-than-life CEO of Velas Corp, were busy patting themselves on the back for pushing me out, I knew something they didn't. Something that gave me the upper hand. The deal in question was supposed to be Velas Corp's crowning achievement, a merger with Nexera Technologies, a rising star in artificial intelligence. Together, they envisioned creating a juggernaut capable of dominating the global market. The press releases were written, the champagne bottles chilled, and the stock prices primed for a meteoric rise. What neither company realized, however, was that I had uncovered a critical flaw in the terms of the agreement, one that could unravel the entire partnership if exposed. It wasn't easy getting to this point. Over the past few months, I had poured myself into understanding every detail of the deal, dissecting contracts, financial reports, and technical specifications until my eyes blurred. At first, it was purely professional curiosity. As the head of business development, it was my responsibility to ensure that any partnership aligned with our long-term goals. But as I dug deeper, patterns began to emerge, patterns that suggested negligence, shortcuts, and outright deception. One evening, after yet another marathon session in the office, I stumbled upon a document buried deep within Nexera's data files. It was labeled innocuously enough, Project Phoenix Risk Assessment, but its contents were anything but harmless. According to the report, Nexera had knowingly concealed a major security vulnerability in their flagship product, one that could compromise sensitive user data on a massive scale. Worse still, Velas Corp's leadership team had either ignored the issue or been deliberately kept in the dark. Either way, proceeding with the merger without addressing this problem would be catastrophic, not just for the companies involved, but for millions of consumers worldwide. At first, I considered going directly to Richard Whitaker. Surely, he wanted to know the truth, right? After all, his reputation and the future of Velas Corp depended on it. But then reality set in. Richard wasn't the same man who had founded the company decades ago. Age and complacency had turned him into a figurehead, content to let his son and a handful of yes-men run the show. Telling him wouldn't solve anything. It would only give James and his cronies time to cover their tracks. No, if I wanted justice, if I wanted to protect the people who trusted us, I had to take matters into my own hands. That's when the idea hit me. If I timed it right, I could use the termination meeting as a distraction. By letting James fire me, I'd create chaos within the organization, forcing them to focus inward while I executed the next phase of my plan. And once the dust settled, they'd realize the full extent of what they'd lost, not just me but the deal itself. Walking out of Velas Corp for the last time felt surreal. The weight of what I was doing pressed down on me, but there was also a strange sense of liberation. For years, I had played by their rules, trying to navigate a system designed to crush anyone who dared challenge it. Now I was finally free. Free to fight back. Free to expose the truth. The first step was simple. I contacted a journalist friend of mine, Rachel, who specialized in investigative reporting. She had helped me uncover the security flaw in Nexera's system, and now she was eager to break the story. "Are you sure about this?" she asked over the phone, her voice tinged with concern. "Once this goes public, there's no turning back." "I'm sure," I replied firmly. "They need to know. Everyone does." Meanwhile, I reached out to several key stakeholders within Nexera, including members of their engineering team who had flagged the issue internally but been silenced. Together, we compiled evidence, emails, memos, internal audits, that painted a damning picture of corporate negligence. By the time Rachel published her exposé, the fallout was immediate. Shares of both companies plummeted, lawsuits piled up, and regulators launched investigations. Back at Velas Corp, panic ensued. James tried to spin the narrative, blaming the leak on rogue employees and external saboteurs. But deep down, he knew the truth. He knew I had orchestrated the whole thing. And though I couldn't see it at the time, that knowledge gnawed at him, eating away at the fragile facade of invincibility he had built around himself. Of course, none of this came without consequences. Losing my job meant losing stability, income, and the safety net I had worked so hard to build. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, unsure whether to admire or fear me. Even my family struggled to understand why I had thrown away everything for what seemed like a vendetta. But I didn't regret it. Not for a second. Because amidst the chaos, something remarkable happened. People started talking. Employees who had suffered in silence found courage to speak out. Journalists began scrutinizing other deals, uncovering similar scandals hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Companies that had operated with impunity were forced to confront their actions, and individuals who had been trampled in the pursuit of profit found a voice. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Alive in a way that no corner office or six-figure salary could provide. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about accountability. About reminding those in power that they weren't untouchable. That their decisions had consequences. That someone, somewhere, was watching. But as satisfying as it was to watch the dominoes fall, I knew the battle wasn't over. Velas Corp and Nexera were just symptoms of a much larger disease, a culture of greed and exploitation that permeated every level of corporate America. To truly make a difference, I needed to do more than dismantle one bad deal or topple one corrupt executive. I needed to spark a movement. And so, as the headlines faded and the world moved on, I got to work. Using the connections I had forged during my time at Velas Corp, I began assembling a coalition of whistleblowers, activists, and reformers determined to hold corporations accountable. Our mission was clear: to shine a light on the darkest corners of the business world and demand change, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. Would it be easy? Absolutely not. Would it come without sacrifice? Definitely not. But as I sat in my tiny apartment, surrounded by stacks of documents and fueled by endless cups of coffee, I couldn't help but feel hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger. Something better. Little did I know, however, that the real fight was only just beginning. The days following the exposé were a whirlwind. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages from reporters, former colleagues, and even strangers who had somehow found my number. Some praised me for taking a stand. Others accused me of being reckless, dangerous, or self-serving. I didn't answer most of them. Instead, I focused on what mattered, building momentum for the coalition I'd envisioned. But it wasn't long before reality came knocking in the form of a lawsuit. Velas Corp's legal team filed a defamation claim against me, alleging that I had acted maliciously by leaking confidential information. They painted me as a disgruntled ex-employee seeking revenge, a narrative James was all too happy to amplify in interviews. Lila Monroe is bitter, he told one journalist during an awkwardly staged press conference. She couldn't handle success, so she tried to tear us down. It hurt, hearing him twist the truth like that, but I refused to let it shake me. If anything, his words only fueled my resolve. I knew the documents we had released spoke for themselves, and thanks to Rachel's meticulous reporting, the public was starting to see through their smokescreen. Still, defending myself legally would be costly, not just financially, but emotionally. Every deposition, every motion, felt like another attempt to silence me, to make me doubt myself. That's when Rachel stepped up again. She introduced me to a lawyer named Marcus Hale, a sharp-witted advocate known for taking on corporate giants. When we first met at a coffee shop near his office, I could tell he wasn't your typical attorney. For one thing, he wore jeans instead of a suit, and his desk was cluttered with stacks of case files and half-empty coffee cups. But beneath the disheveled exterior lay a brilliant strategist with a passion for justice. "Look," Marcus said after I explained the situation, "this isn't going to be easy. These guys have deep pockets and no moral compass. But if you're willing to fight dirty and smart, we can turn this around." His confidence reassured me, though I couldn't ignore the nagging fear in the back of my mind. Fighting dirty. That wasn't who I was, or at least, it hadn't been until now. Yet here I was, preparing to go toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful people in the industry. While Marcus worked on mounting our defense, I threw myself into organizing the coalition. We called ourselves the Accountability Project, a name chosen deliberately to reflect our mission. Our goal was simple yet ambitious: to create a network of insiders, employees, contractors, consultants who could safely report unethical practices without fear of retaliation. Think of it as a whistleblower hotline, but with teeth. We partnered with cybersecurity experts to develop encrypted channels for sharing evidence, ensuring that participants' identities remained protected. At first, recruiting members was slow going. Many were hesitant, afraid of losing their jobs or facing backlash. But then something unexpected happened. A young engineer named Priya reached out to me after reading about the Accountability Project online. She worked for a major pharmaceutical company and claimed her employer was falsifying clinical trial data to rush a drug to market. "I've tried raising concerns internally," she wrote in her email, "but they ignored me. I don't know what else to do." Her story struck a chord. It reminded me of why I started this in the first place, not for glory or revenge, but to give people like Priya a voice. Together, we gathered enough evidence to alert regulators, triggering an investigation that ultimately halted the drug's approval process. It was a small victory, but it proved that we could make a difference. Word spread quickly after that. Within weeks, we received dozens of tips from across industries: finance, tech, healthcare, manufacturing. Each case was different, but they shared a common thread: greed over ethics, profit over people. As the coalition grew, so did its impact. Companies began scrambling to clean up their act, knowing that any misstep could land them in the spotlight next. Yet despite our successes, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late nights spent poring over spreadsheets and legal briefs left me exhausted, both physically and mentally. I missed the simplicity of having a steady paycheck, a predictable routine. And while I believe wholeheartedly in our cause, I couldn't help but wonder, was I becoming the very thing I despised? Someone who played games, manipulated systems, and wielded power for personal gain? One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment staring at a mountain of paperwork, I allowed myself to entertain those thoughts. What if I was wrong? What if all of this, the lawsuits, the media circus, the endless strategizing, was doing more harm than good? Just as I was spiraling into self-doubt, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Rachel. "Remember why you started." Simple words, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. Of course, I hadn't embarked on this journey for recognition or revenge. I had done it because someone needed to, because silence wasn't an option anymore. With renewed determination, I got back to work. Meanwhile, tensions between James and me reached a boiling point. Though we hadn't spoken directly since my termination, he made sure to keep tabs on me through thinly veiled threats and passive-aggressive comments in interviews. "Lila thinks she's some kind of hero," he sneered in one particularly memorable exchange. But heroes don't hide behind anonymous sources and stolen documents. His words stung, not because they were true, but because they hinted at a deeper truth. James saw this as personal. To him, I wasn't just a former employee challenging his authority. I was a mirror reflecting everything he hated about himself. Arrogance, entitlement, fear of failure. And the more desperate he became to discredit me, the more obvious his flaws became to everyone else. Then one day he crossed a line. During a heated deposition related to the lawsuit, James leaned forward in his chair, his face twisted with barely contained rage. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he spat. "Just wait until the world sees who you really are." For a moment, I froze. Not because I was afraid of him. He was nothing more than a spoiled, rich kid throwing a tantrum, but because I realized how much energy I had wasted worrying about what he thought of me. He didn't matter. None of them did. What mattered was staying true to the values that had brought me here in the first place. When the deposition ended, I walked out of the room feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time, I understood that winning wasn't about proving James wrong or getting back at Velascorp. It was about continuing to fight for what was right, regardless of the cost. As winter turned to spring, the tide began to shift. Public opinion swung decisively in our favor, thanks in part to Rachel's relentless reporting and a growing chorus of supporters who rallied behind the accountability project. Even some of Velascorp's own employees started speaking out, accusing management of fostering a toxic culture of fear and intimidation. One senior executive resigned in protest, citing irreconcilable differences with the company's leadership. Another leaked internal memos showing how James had actively covered up the Nexera scandal. With each new revelation, the pressure mounted on Richard Whittaker to step down. At first, he resisted, clinging to his position like a drowning man grasping at driftwood. But when shareholders launched a formal vote of no confidence, he had no choice but to retire quietly, leaving James to pick up the pieces. And pick them up he did, with disastrous results. Without his father's steadying influence, James's incompetence became glaringly apparent. Projects stalled, key partnerships dissolved, and morale plummeted. By summer, Velascorp's stock price had dropped nearly 40%, wiping out billions in market value. Analysts predicted bankruptcy within the year unless drastic changes were made. Watching it all unfold from the sidelines, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice, however imperfect, had been served. Sadness because so many innocent people, hardworking employees, loyal customers, would suffer as a result of decisions made far above their pay grade. Still, I couldn't afford to dwell on it. There was still too much work to be done. Too many battles to fight. Too many voices waiting to be heard. By fall, the accountability project had grown into something larger than I ever imagined. We had expanded internationally, partnering with activists in Europe, Asia, and South America to tackle corruption on a global scale. Governments began enacting stricter regulations, inspired in part by the wave of scandals we had exposed. Corporations, once untouchable, now operated under increased scrutiny, knowing that one misstep could bring them crashing down. Through it all, I remained committed to the cause, but not without scars. The lawsuit dragged on for months, draining resources and testing my patience. Relationships suffered, including friendships I had taken for granted. And though I tried to stay grounded, there were days when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush me. Yet even in my darkest moments, I never lost sight of the bigger picture. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt powerless, invisible, or silenced. Together, we were rewriting the rules, redefining what it meant to hold power accountable. And somewhere along the way, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't the endgame. It never had been. What I wanted, what we all wanted, was change. Real, lasting change. And if that meant sacrificing everything I had, then so be it. Because sometimes, the greatest victories aren't measured in dollars or headlines. Sometimes, they're found in the quiet moments when someone whispers, "Thank you for giving me a voice." Those moments made it all worth it.